Welcome to Smash Avo Property. Today, a great friend of mine and former guest of the podcast, Joey DeGarda, invited me to come onto his new podcast, The Millennial Investor. At the same time, Joey also suggested I need an episode of my story on Smash Avo Property. So here it is. This podcast was all Joey's planning, and I asked him not to just run through my usual set of questions. So I really had no idea what was coming. And Joey sure didn't hold back when asking some of the tough questions.
Mate, it's a bit of a curveball coming up, but kids on the horizon, what will that do for your investment journey? Will that delve things? Will it set it back? Is it part of your plans at all?
As always, seek your own professional financial, legal, and property investing advice for your current situation. Everything we talk about is just our opinion and general in nature and should never be considered as personal advice. So without any further ado, let's get house hunting with, me.
G'day and welcome to the Millennial Investor podcast. My name is Joey DeGarda and today we have a very special episode where I have a wonderful guest and a good friend of mine, Jordan Jong. Jordan, thanks so much for joining us.
Mate, it is an absolute pleasure to be on your podcast. I've been listening to every single one of your episodes so far and even I've learned a few things or two. So I'm very impressed, mate, and excited to get into today's podcast.
Mate, absolutely not. I'm in podcast royalty here with you. So guys, if you're not familiar with Jordan's podcast, do you mind telling us a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's called Smash Avo Property. Basically, it's just a kind of the same sort of concept as yours. It's a millennial podcast, primarily focused on property investing, but just about talking to people predominantly under 30 who have had the opportunity to build a portfolio. They go into a little bit of depth about how they got started, what inspired them, their deposits, and all that sort of stuff. So similar kind of format to what we'll do today, but just other property investors sharing their story, really.
Wonderful. And mate, as I've said to you previously, just before we jumped on the podcast, I'm really interested in kind of sharing your story. Obviously on your podcast, you get young investors like myself on there to share their story. So we just really wanted to take a moment to share your story with not only my audience, but also yours. So I'm going to jump straight into it and I wanted to learn a little bit more about you. Do you mind sharing with us your age, where you're from, what you do for work, where you're born, and give us a little bit of a rundown on your history?
Yeah, for sure. So currently 27, grew up in Sydney, now live in Melbourne. So grew up in the Hills district in Sydney till I was about 22. Then I was in a relationship for 2 years with my now wife and moved to Melbourne when I was 22 and been here for 4 years now. So it's a little bit of background of where I grew up.
Why did you transition across?
Just my wife. She lives here. Her whole family's here. Right. So
you moved for love.
I moved for love, mate. I moved for love, and I'm so glad that I did. It was well worth the move. But yeah, back from that, after school, I went to uni. I studied a Bachelor of Housing. I always knew that I wanted to get into the property sector. I just didn't know what and how and everything else. So Bachelor of Housing is basically construction management, but it's more residential focused rather than commercial focused. So from there, I worked for a major residential builder in Sydney and sort of grew my way up the corporate ladder to where I am now. So I've been there for 8 years and my official title is data scientist. But yeah, basically I just look at business dashboards and analytics and all that sort of stuff every day, which is really the bread and butter of my property investing journey too. I really delve into the data and analytics there. So I guess that's where the love fell in. But yeah, I think back in the day, a bit of the actual background, my dad was a real estate agent, has been since I was about 10 years old. And so he's sort of really driven that property drive for me. Growing up, he had a bookshelf full of property books, Steve McKnight, Margaret Lomax, like just all these sort of, really big property guys. Yeah, the classics from back then. And I don't know what inspired me to read them, but thankfully I did. And I actually think it was Robert Kiyosaki who really inspired me. Like his Rich Dad Poor Dad was the first book that I read, and that drove me to read the rest of them. And then I think from a young age I just always inspired to be a property investor. I just saw how people had generated wealth through property. Even Dad used to sell really high end market properties, $3 million properties back then too, was a lot more than they are today. But I was lucky enough to hang out with these guys. He would hang out with them on the weekend. They became really good family friends. And you just sort of see how common property was for all of them and how they'd all generated significant wealth through property. And so I always knew that I had to make my money work for me rather than me work for my money.
Mate, that's absolutely wonderful. And you've pretty much ticked off one of the leading points that I was going to try and kick off the conversation about, and that was why property. And I think you've covered that for us pretty well. And I was going to lead on to by saying, like, what got you interested? And it's obviously that family upbringing for you being so immersed in that, with your dad being in the real estate game as well. Was there anything else kind of growing up that helped you aspire to become a property investor?
Yeah, I think I had, I had a lot of other friends at school whose parents had been property investors themselves. And so I sort of, again, saw that, how they had managed to do it. My mum was also on a Channel 9 show called Changing Rooms. So, she was an interior designer.
Love that show.
Yeah. So
wow.
it's actually funny going back and watching some of the episodes these days. They're a classic. But yeah, I think, she was really into that renovation game as well. So I think, to be completely honest with you, as you said, it's that family upbringing. I've just been completely surrounded by property my whole life and seen how it's transformed other people.
Mate, so it's clearly in your DNA. Delving a little bit more into the upbringing, do you mind telling us what kind of conversations around money and finances were like in the household when you were growing up? Was it even spoken about it at all?
I think so. My parents got divorced when I was 10, so it was kind of two separate families. Mum was kind of a bit more sheltered and didn't really want to speak about it a whole lot, which was fine. It was a tough situation for her and all that sort of stuff. Dad, on the other hand, is Dutch, and I don't know if you know many Dutch people, but they're quite tight. And so growing up with Dad, and like I absolutely love him for it now, but I hated it at the time. He was so tight, and he taught me so many lessons, but things like, we'd go out for a family dinner and like him and me would go out and I'd have to pay my half and he'd have to pay his half. And then
love that.
Yeah, I know. It's like at the time I was like, oh, can't you just pay for my dinner, Dad? But, it taught me so many lessons. But even to the extent of, in my later years, maybe 17, 18, me and Dad actually moved out and lived together, but, we would both pay our rent. So it wasn't like, I was free holding off Dad and, I actually had to work for my money. And I think that really distilled some of the, foundations of the value of money at a young age, and what really the cost of living is. It wasn't necessarily conversations, like we wouldn't talk about savings or any sort of that stuff, but it was more the fundamentals of the value of money.
Mate, so clearly not your kind of textbook upbringing, and it's wonderful to be able to share with the audience, because obviously so many, non-conformed family upbringings that people are seeing themselves in today as well. So it's great that you can share that kind of background with our audience, because of course some of them may have similar experiences, and that's one right out of the box. So definitely left of field, and it's going to lead me right on to the next question I wanted to ask you, and that was how you went about saving for your first deposit, particularly if you're paying rent at such a young age as well. So how much was your first deposit, and how did you go about saving for it?
Yeah, so I think I got a 90% LVR. I can't remember exactly how much it was. I know it was more than 45 grand. It probably was less than 55 grand. So probably around that sort of area. But yeah, no, it was completely tough. I not only was I paying rent, but I was doing uni full time. And I essentially was working full time and working on the weekend. So my first job was at an aquarium. I still love having fish. The fish tanks, they're my thing. So that was a bit of fun on the weekend. I used to be a sales representative at an aquarium for, I think, 6 years or so. So that was my weekends gone. And then as I was working for this company, I think I started on 3 days, and then within 6 months I was 4 days, and then by year 2 of uni I was working full time plus studying at nights, and taking off the odd day here or there for the lectures that I had to be at. So it was pretty hectic at that time. I was working 2 jobs, pretty much 7 days a week. I think I worked 7 days a week straight for 6 months. So pretty full on there. But I think just having those early fundamentals of saving, I would always pay myself first. I think that was the biggest thing for me is and what I used to do is have a separate bank account that had no ATM access. I made my dad create the password for it, so I couldn't even log into it, and essentially I just had automatic, every time I get paid I had automatic transfer into that account. So it would be money that I wouldn't even know that I had really, and I'd never check the balance in there because if I knew, then I'd be convinced to use it. So I think, those fundamental lessons really have helped me today, because now I can control my own money and I've got full access to everything that I have, and I know how much money I've got in there. But, just building that habit of putting away your money before you have the opportunity to spend it, I think was the key to saving that deposit.
Now, was the hard work, the discipline, the dedication, the 7-day a week working, was that with the goal in mind of buying a property, or were you just doing it for the sake of doing it, or did you have that really hard goal that you were driving towards?
I think, definitely. Ultimately, it was the property. I think, I started reading those books when I was really young, probably 14, 15. And I think, being the age of 18 to 21, I kind of enjoyed my life a little bit too. And I sort of lost vision of being a property investor. But ultimately, I knew in the back of my head that I did need to buy a property. So I think that was always in the back goal. But it was just, it was more of a drive just to get myself ahead. Really, I knew the value of having money, and definitely the ultimate goal was to be able to buy a property.
Mate, and do you mind sharing with us what that first purchase was? If you got a little bit, even some numbers regarding what you bought it for. So obviously, we know you put down something around $50,000, but what you bought it for and why you decided to buy that particular property.
Yeah, so, and I think this is where my story sort of aligns with a lot of other people my age. Like I didn't buy my first property at 18 or anything like that, which, a lot of my guests on my podcast kind of did. But for me, and this is why I'm so lucky that I moved to Melbourne, because the area that we lived in Melbourne, I could sort of see something happening similar that what happened to the Hills District in Sydney when I was living there. And now I know that this term is called gentrification, which is essentially, new cafes and shops and restaurants sort of opening up, and the younger sort of artsy generation are moving in, and this sort of increases the value of property over a period of 5 to 10 years, say. And I sort of really saw this occurring in a certain area that we had moved into. And so, and it was funny enough because my wife's Nonna and Nunu actually live in that area. They lived in that area for 30 years. So it was quite funny to watch it happen, and them sort of move on out of that area, and the new sort of generation sort of move into that area. And yeah, exactly. And so, and that's why I was fortunate enough to move to Melbourne. That's why I say it, because the price points in Melbourne were significantly different to the ones in Sydney. So if I had bought in Sydney, it would have been, $800-900 back in Sydney, or $1 million, not shy of. But what I bought in Melbourne was actually $415,000. And, it was a 2-bedroom villa or flat, if you'd like to call it. It was a block of 5 townhouses, but it wasn't a townhouse. It's a single story. So 2 townhouses and 3 units on there. And it was just in an area that was gentrifying. It was it's an 8-minute walk to the station, and then a 20-minute ride into the CBD. It's a 12-minute drive to the airport. A whole bunch of new hipster cafes had just moved into the area. And so, of the fundamentals that I had sort of preliminarily learnt back then, it sort of ticked all those boxes. The only thing that sort of didn't tick was it was brand new. So now, I wouldn't take that purchase back, but now that I know more about, sort of brand new properties and depreciation and all that sort of stuff, I probably wouldn't buy a brand new place again, but it's done me well. So yeah, that was the first purchase.
Mate, where would you think that property would be valued now? You said you bought it at 415, was it?
Yeah, correct. And
then, where do you think it'd be valued now?
So I got it refinanced at the start of 2019 for $580,000. So
wow. Okay. Yeah. And when did you buy that? What year did you buy it?
Bought it in 2016. So for 3 years, it's about
best part of 3 years.
Yeah,
great growth.
11.8% compounding every year, I think, since then.
Mate, no one's going to complain with that. No one at all.
Exactly.
In terms of a rental yield, this is, I think, where your story might differ from most people. Give us, firstly, what the, I suppose, normal rental yield on that property would be, so the normal weekly rent for that property, and then kind of tell me a little bit about how your story differs from that.
Yeah, so back then I think we got quoted $380. So I don't know what the rental.
So it's still not too bad. Yeah, it's not too bad.
It's not bad, but that was actually our principal place of residence. So we
Right.
lived in it for 3 years at that point in
Yep.
time. So I think we got it re-quoted for rent recently for $420. So it's increased a little bit, but still around that same sort of mark. And I think where you're going with this conversation of how it's changed now is we've actually bought the second one, but we're currently living in a place. We're currently renting in the place that we are now, and we've decided to Airbnb out that first property. So we've been Airbnbing since March 2019. And I guess the essential backing for that is we stayed at a little Airbnb in Rye, which is kind of like a beachy area down in Melbourne, and it's got some nice wineries and all that sort of stuff down there. And the place that we stayed at was a inbuilt unit, had a kitchen, it had a bed, it had a bathroom, but it was all in that same sort of one area. And I think we paid something like $320 a night. And my wife and I just looked at each other and we thought, well, why can't we do this? And little did we realize that, obviously it was in an area that was highly desirable and we were in a sort of community area. But luckily enough for us, we are near sort of the central CBD. We've got that great public access and great airport access. But yeah, it was a bit of a throwball. I mean, we moved out with my wife's siblings, so it was we didn't really know what to expect, and I think we did that just to ensure that our costs weren't too high in case everything went down the drain. But I mean, we've had great return on that since we've done it. So today would be 12 months since we've been running Airbnb. I don't know the total amount, but we've averaged about 3,300 per month of income off that property. And I think it costs us around $1,700 a month to run. And that's on an interest-only mortgage. So making some good profit there.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that makes sense. So overall, as you know, I'm doing that with one of my properties as well, but I've found it quite intensive, and I've shared with you my desire to kind of maybe step away from it because it is so time consuming. What's your overall, I mean, obviously the returns are quite healthy and you're happy with that, but you're pretty comfy with how things are going and happy to keep it the way it is?
Yeah, we're currently pretty happy to keep it where it is. I'm just going to pull up my spreadsheet so I can give you some numbers. So our average night stay is actually 18 nights. So people are staying for, nearly 3 weeks per stay. And I think, we've sort of put in some limits in there that, we've got a 5-night minimum. So we don't do those, every second day changes, because if we had to, it probably just wouldn't be viable. So we've gone down the route of these longer term stays, and we actually got quite lucky because around the corner from us is Qantas's headquarters for training. So a lot of Qantas pilots in training will actually come and stay with us, and they're in training for like 6 to 12 weeks sort of thing. So I think that's what really pushes that nightly stay out a little bit. So that, that's been a lot of less hassle than we would have. I mean, you know what it's like, Joey, sometimes, you rock up to the house and it's absolutely filthy. It's a pigsty, and you just want to, yell at someone or, try and charge them for extra cleaning or whatever. So we've definitely had those days, and it is a lot of hassle. And if you do have to do it every night, I can just imagine how much extra work that would be. But so far so good. I think if circumstances were to change, we're probably looking at buying the third property now. So we don't know if we will consider Airbnb that one out, or maybe just doing the usual rental. The only other negative with Airbnb is it's a business. It's considered a business. It's not a rental income. So the banks don't see the income off Airbnb as a guaranteed rental. And I think that's sort of hindered our borrowing capacity a little bit, because we don't have that guarantee. So we've actually some banks need 2 years of financial returns to validate that Airbnb income. So we've got the first 12 months. We'll have the financial year after this year. But I think just taking that into consideration when presuming you can just Airbnb out a place and keep borrowing.
Yeah, well, mate, it seems like you've got the balance right there, and it seems to be a viable option for you in the short term. It's obviously got its potential pitfalls, but you seem to be navigating the space quite well. Now, you also alluded to a second property purchase. So there's more than one property in the portfolio. How did we go about raising the deposit? Did you pull out some equity? Did you save up more cash? Tell me a little bit about it if you've got some numbers to share as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'll and again, I just want to delve into my story because I think it differs a lot from the conversations I've had with my other guests. Is we so I got married pretty young. I got married, so we bought our first one at 22, and then I got married at 23. So we pretty much bought the first one because we needed a place to live.
Yep.
But since then, we've traveled quite a bit as well. So we've been all over Europe and America, and we've probably spent, I'd say, 60 grand on holidays over that time. And so, I could be kicking myself now. I could have easily bought a third one by now with using that money instead. But we're kind of, it's a phase in our life where we don't know, how many opportunities we're going to get to do that sort of traveling. So we kind of took advantage when we did. But in saying that, given the equity that I've gotten out of the first one, at the start of 2019, we're lucky enough to pull out a straight 100 grand of equity, and that's because I had a 90% LVR to start with when we first got the mortgage, and then the second one's pulled out as an 80% LVR. So essentially, we pulled out that 100 grand and put it straight into the second one. The second one we bought for $480,000, and the deposit wasn't. I think all up, it cost me about $130,000. So I only really put $30,000 of my own cash into that property.
Own money.
Yeah. So
what was that property?
So this was a unit. So there's one above and one below. 2-bedroom, but has high ceilings. It's on the bottom floor. It's not the top floor one. So it does have those outdoor living areas. It's in a block of 8, and it's a double brick, red brick, built in the 70s, sort of old style, classic. Yeah, exactly. Sort of the the education that I've had between the first one and the second one, you can really tell the difference. I sort of did the research and the historical growth on those ones, and I think it was about 9.5% growth for the last 30 years. Annually. So pretty happy with those sort of growth rates over the historical period.
And so is that in a similar kind of pocket of Melbourne than your first property was?
Yeah, it's probably exactly the same, but 5 minutes closer into the CBD. So 8 minutes, exactly the same. 8 minutes walking distance to the nearest train station, about a 15-minute ride into the CBD, and then it's obviously a little bit further away from the airport. So I think it's about a 18-minute drive away from the airport. But yeah, same sort of northwest area in Melbourne. And I think purely, from now on, I will diversify a little bit. So the next one, I'm obviously going to buy in a different area of Melbourne or even go interstate. But I think for me, I really knew that area quite well. And so I knew, the streets and the people and the districts and the cafes and, all the good amendments because I'd lived there for 3 years and known that area quite well. I think that's really what convinced me of the area, and obviously the growth that I had from my one as well. But yeah, this was a little bit into the state a little bit more, but it had already gentrified a little bit. So I'm not getting that sort of ripple effect of gentrification, but given the historical growth rate, I was quite happy with that one.
Yeah, and I understand when people say you need to diversify the types of properties to buy, diversify in terms of your suburb, state, and whatever else. But if you're onto a winning formula, if you've purchased a property that's proven to historically track well, and you've already got some blood in the game and some skin in the game there as well in terms of what your first purchase was, why try and reinvent the wheel? As you know about myself, I've got 2 properties in the exact same block just because the first one fared so well for me. So it seems as though you've done the same thing. There's no point trying to diversify outside of your areas of expertise if there are great opportunities in your backyard like you've been able to stumble across as well. So that property there, you purchased not that long ago as well. So I'm assuming there's not enough equity there to move on to the third purchase, but you did allude to another one coming up on the horizons. Do you mind sharing with us what your kind of aspirations are for the next property?
Yeah, so that second one's the Airbnb too, and so given the current interest rate environment at the moment, and it's bringing in the same sort of income, so about $3,300 per month, and it's costing me about $15,000, and that's purely because most of the mortgage is sitting in the first property. So I'm making some good money off both those properties, and our savings has really grown. So we bought that one I think we settled in August 2019. So we've had it for the good part of 8 months or so. But yeah, really saved quite heavily on that one. I think we've got about 70 grand worth of savings since then. But we're also going through the process of refinancing at the moment. So I got that second one refinanced. It came back at 540. So
Still a little bit of money there. That's great.
A little bit of growth in the last 8 months. But I don't know if I will go ahead with refinancing just yet. I might just wait until there's a bit more growth in it. But yeah, we're getting the first one reevaluated again now as well. So we'll see what that comes in at. And I guess depending on, how they both stack up, we might pull out a little bit of equity and then have enough to go again. But yeah, I think for the most part, I'd like to continue that savings track and try and save as much as possible and just use pure savings for the next deposit, and then hopefully use the first and second one to sort of leapfrog into the fourth and fifth.
And what will you want the next property to look like? What would it be similar to what you've got now? Would it be something completely different suburb, different state?
Yes, same sort of thing. I really like Melbourne just because, as I said before, I can sort of see the same gentrification happening in certain areas that it did in Sydney. I mean, the Sydney and Melbourne markets are completely different, but Melbourne for me is a much more comfortable price point than buying in Sydney. I probably would like to buy something in Sydney. I know a lot of people talk about Brisbane, but I'm just not comfortable with it myself yet. Probably either Melbourne or Sydney, but obviously I might even try the sort of east of Melbourne a little bit. Same sort of dwelling. I don't. I like I know land is important, but it's land value and not land size. So sort of something close to the CBD with a bit of land content, a little land value, but obviously sort of 60s, 70s built, double brick, sort of that classical. You can't go wrong with it, sort of thing. And
no frills.
Yeah, no frills. Exactly right.
Yep. Mate, it's a bit of a curveball coming up, but the kids on the horizon, what will that do for your investment journey? Will that delve things? Will it set it back? Is it part of your plans at all?
Yeah, kids are definitely on the horizons, depending on who you ask, me or my wife. We're definitely planning for. As I said, we've travelled quite a bit in the last couple of years, so kids are definitely either this year or next year. Hence, trying to get into this third one as soon as possible. Yep. So, I think the plan will be to get into the third one as soon as possible, whether she's pregnant at the time or not, and then maybe we'll just sit steady for 2 years or something like that, and until we're ready to go again, and sort of just make sure that we're comfortable. I mean, it's a low interest environment right now, so it's probably not a bad time to set ourselves up for that sort of next phase of life. But yeah, I think speaking of kids and the next one and all that sort of stuff, I'm definitely putting a 6-month buffer in, so 6 months worth of expenses sitting in the offset account, and I won't touch that. And I think that'll just give us the peace of mind to sleep at night to say, if my wife was to stop working or, whatever is required in additional finances there, we're sitting pretty safe, and we won't have to dramatically sell an asset to try and financially be stable. And my wife runs her own business anyway, so with her mum and her sister, so it's not like she's going to stop working completely. It might just be, down to a couple of days or something like that. So
there's obviously a little bit more flexibility for her in that role.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that's the game plan there. Obviously, having the buffer is our number one.
And so do you think, like, as a bit of advice for some millennials that are looking to settle down with partners and starting up a family, that is a bit of good advice, good counsel for young investors to potentially kind of take track of where you are now? I understand that you might drop down to one income. Do you have any other kind of tips for, obviously you're going through that now, what other tips you might provide other than, say, saving that 6-month buffer in your circumstance for people that are looking to potentially settle down and start up a family?
Yeah, I think the biggest advice that I could give is prepare for the unknown, because so many things can change in so many years. I mean, if you think about my story I've just talked about, in the last 4 years, I've moved to Melbourne, got married, traveled, half around the world, and potentially thinking of having kids in 4 years. That's a pretty short amount of time. And so a lot of the people that I've talked to, or a lot of friends that I've talked to who have kind of bought, off the plan apartments or same sort of thing with the 2-bedroom unit, they don't really realize how quickly life does change, and they've sort of bought these properties as a principal place of residence and didn't realize that they'd soon have to upgrade. And so if that's the plan for you, if that's your ultimate goal, and you want to settle down, have a family, have a kid, and move on your life in that retrospect, think about those things now. Like if you can buy a principal place of residence that has a couple of extra bedrooms, has a second living room, so that when the kids are older, they've got a place to hang out, and think about all these things that you may want in your later stages of life, then that's a much better investment for yourself than to just buy a little 2-bedroom unit that you think you're going to live in for the rest of your life, because the cost of trading property is so expensive. And I've got older friends who have bought and sold 3 times because they've constantly needed to upgrade more space, more additional bedrooms, and they want another living area, then they want more land so the kids can run around. And so that's cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. And if they had just bought their end family home first, then they would have been much better off just sitting on that one and not losing all that sort of stamp duty and selling costs and agent fees and everything else that goes along with it. So if you do have potential to buy the family home now instead of maybe buying 1 or 2 smaller little investments, then maybe that's a better option.
That's a great piece of advice for the listeners there. Really appreciate that. So in kind of summarising the portfolio as it sits today, do you mind sharing with us what the approximate value is and what your current LVR is of the global portfolio?
Yeah, so the second one got valued at $450, and I'm just going to do a few little calculations if you don't mind.
Yeah, right.
Yep. The first one sold for the first one's been revalued at $550, and the second one, let's just say $620 for good measure. So it's 1.16, so just shy of 1.2. My current debt is $848,000. So 848 divided by 116. Yeah, so sitting at about 70% LVR, so it's 72% LVR. So
pretty comfy LVR considering where we normally suggest for a comfortable level to be under 80%. So you've got a fair buffer there, and I'm actually really glad that you did have to do those calculations out loud just so the listeners can understand how we actually calculated that LVR. He actually took the debt and divided that by the purchase price to come up with that percentage there. So are you feeling really comfortable around that level? Would you be willing to leverage up a little bit more? Would you be trying to drive that down? Or are you happy with where it is at the moment?
I am really happy with where I am. I think I would. I'm very comfortable with debt, especially in this sort of low interest rate environment. So, as much as I could borrow would be essential. I think probably love to keep it at minimum 80%. I think that's a good buffer zone. But obviously, the more I can borrow now, I'm still in that heavy sort of acquisition phase. So another 1 to 3 would be ideal for me. But I wouldn't sort of track higher than that 80% LVR.
And in terms of your finance so far, a couple of questions paired together. Are our loans P&I, or are they interest only? And have you used a mortgage broker to help you obtain your finance, or have you done it through an institutional bank and just gone straight to the branch manager?
Yeah, I used a really good mortgage broker from the get-go. So he's helped me sort of get those initial mortgages and sort of refinance and all that sort of stuff. He was actually working in the office that my dad had his real estate office in. So that's where that connection came through. And I think now I'm at a point where I kind of need a more sort of investor savvy mortgage broker. So sort of fishing out there to see what else is out there. Joey's been kind enough to pass me on his mortgage broker, so I'm keen to see what he can do for me. But yeah, they're both interest only terms at the moment. As I said, I refinanced sort of last year, so there were 5 years interest only. So 4 years left of interest only if I don't refinance. But that's just been a way for me to sort of lower my costs and be able to save as much. But as I said, I have an offset account on both of my mortgages, so the money goes straight in there, parked against it, so I'm not paying extra interest on there. I'm trying to keep it at interest only as long as possible until I sort of come to the consolidation phase of my portfolio. But that probably won't happen until I'm about 40.
For a little while. Now, being the young, smart, sophisticated investor that you are, there may be none, but if there have been any mistakes along the investment journey, do you mind sharing with us a couple or 1 or 2?
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's a mistake or not. I wouldn't classify it as a mistake, but obviously not buying the third one and traveling instead. I think life experiences are more valuable than wealth generation, especially in this younger stage of my life. I mean, I've still got another 60 years of investing to go. So, but
exactly
I could have got the third one. I think, as I said, the first investment property being brand new, I mean, it has done really well, but who's to say that that's going to be replicated again in the next 5 years? It might have just been an early gentrification sort of growth, and now it might be stable. So you really don't know the full impact of the property you purchased until 10 years after you buy it. So that may still be classified as a mistake, even though I've done quite well with it already. But yeah, I think they're probably the most predominant two. I mean, the common one that I get from most of my guests is they just didn't buy more when they could, and I think that's probably my third one, is not buying at a younger age or getting in early enough. You know, I was actually going to buy an $80,000 property when I turned 18, but backed out of it because it was in Northern Territory and I had no idea what I was doing. So that was probably a good decision.
A blessing in disguise. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I'd love to go and see the value. I can't even remember what the property was, but I'd love to go see the value.
It's probably worth the same, if not less, now.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, in saying that, you go.
Yeah, but in terms of you trying to say that those were mistakes, like there's obviously the trade-off, between buying another property and your third property or experiencing the world and traveling through Europe and America with your now wife. I mean, like, it's a clear trade-off that needs to be made, but you're in a fortunate enough position that you had two properties behind you, where I know countless number of people that have been doing that year on year and then wonder why they don't have any money or anything to show for it. So I don't know if we could say that as a mistake. It was a conscious decision that you made. Sure, it came at the cost of not being able to buy your third property by now, but you're clearly well on track. And in terms of the other property, I mean, the fact that it was a new build, yeah, sure, you've learnt your lesson from there, but you've seen great growth from that as well. So I appreciate, that you've called them out as potential would I do them again. But I mean, the answer would probably be yes. By the sounds of things, you had a great, wonderful life experience, and you've also achieved wonderful growth with that first purchase. So to call them mistakes, I think you're being a little bit harsh on yourself there.
It's all right. You're your own biggest critic, so I'm happy with that.
Exactly. Mate, in terms of education or any kind of tips and tricks that you've got for young investors trying to educate themselves, what advice would you give, whether it's the book recommendation, you can give yourself another shout out for your podcast as well, but what kind of educational tips would you give millennial investors?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you and I have had this discussion before, Joey. There's just so much content out there right now. And so rather than saying go and listen to the Property Couch or go and listen to a podcast or go and read a specific book, I think a better piece of advice is just be careful of, how many pieces of content you listen to, because there's so many people out there who commentate on the property market and they've all got their own individual opinions. And, you could read one comment or one post one day and then the next day read another one and they're completely contradicting. And so I think a better piece for your education is learn the commonalities between them all, learn things that people say, like, diversification and all these sort of things that people really talk about, and understand the fundamentals and use that to build your own knowledge and start to research those things for yourself, because it's all well and good. I mean, Joe and I are avid podcast listeners. I've listened to probably, and him too, have listened to probably every single property podcast there is out there. And, by all means, if that's your thing, go for gold. I've learned so much out of that. But I think really holistically, if you've only got a certain amount of time or certain amount of effort to put into investing in your education, just pick one or two really good podcasts or one or two really good mentors and sort of follow them and track their understanding. And even if you have less time than that, use someone like yourself, Joey, like a buyer's agent who has spent the time and learnt that education and use their skills to your benefit. The cost of using a buyer's agent is nothing in comparison to the education level that they have. So if you are shy of time, then build the team of mentors around yourself who can help you get through that phase of life. And I think through walking the path with them, you'll learn a ton as well.
Mate, I think that's a great bit of advice. And just to kind of add on to what you said there, and if your audience was to listen to two podcasts, make sure it's Smashed Avo and the Millennial Investor. No, I'm just kidding. There's plenty of educational pieces out there. So just wanted to, before we wrapped up, I just really wanted to kind of get philosophical and just understand what your end goal is. So what's the end goal? What's the dream? What is it that you hope that property can bring you?
Yeah, I don't know. I've kind of been surrounded by, wealthy people my entire life. And I can tell you firsthand, I mean, we've been completely wealthy and gone through divorce and had, no feet on the table at some nights. So I can definitely tell you that wealth doesn't bring happiness. So I think for me, number one is financial security. So I want to have that financial independence for my family and make sure that money is never a concern. I think that's the first and foremost, whether that be having 10 million in the account or a million or even 100,000 in the account, just to know that we're safe. And then secondly is to just help others. Like if I'm happy with the money that I have, I think, helping others through charities or some sort of way or through the education piece. And I mean, that's why I really started the podcast, is to help others build their own wealth in their own portfolios and educate themselves on that sort of thing. And so, first and foremost, being comfortable and financial independence. And then secondly, to help as many people as I can, I guess.
Mate, that's absolutely wonderful to hear that it's just not all about cash, and you got some foresight, and it's more just about security and then kind of giving back and helping other people to achieve that. So that's absolutely sensational, and it's something that you don't hear every day with most investors. You just hear, I want to have $1 million passive income every year. So it's really kind of humbling and great to see how kind of modest you are there in terms of what the end goal is with property.
Thanks, mate. I really appreciate that.
Mate, I'm just going to give you one last little plug before we wrap up. So for any of my listeners, please jump on, like and subscribe Smashed Avo Property with Jordan. It's a wonderful podcast where he gets on young investors, generally under the age of about 30, isn't it, Jordan?
Yeah, under 30.
Yeah, well, they share their stories, and he's a wonderful host, and I'm so fortunate to have him on the podcast. I really appreciate you jumping on.
Mate, it was an absolute pleasure. And if you haven't already, go and listen to Joey's episode on Smashed Avo Property. He's already gone through his portfolio on his podcast, but he delves a little bit more into himself and his backstory as well. But yeah, mate, I really appreciate you having me on, and I can't wait to. I'm actually going to post this episode on my podcast as well. So hopefully some of the listeners jump onto your podcast. So if you're listening on Smashed Avo, make sure you go and check out Joey's podcast. I'll put a link in the show notes for you.
Guys, again, thank you so much for tuning in. And Jordan, it's been wonderful. Until next time.
Thanks, Joey. I'll speak to you soon.
I wanted to say a massive thank you again to Joey for inviting me onto his podcast and allowing me to recycle the episode here on Smashed Avo Property. I hope that gave you a little more insight about me and my backstory. Joey and I are currently planning a series of cross-podcast episodes covering a range of property topics. If there's something you feel you would like us to cover or have any questions we could help you with, feel free to shoot them through to hi@jordanjong.com. I'm always looking for more guests to come onto the show. If you're under 30 and have one or more investment properties, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, I would love to talk to you about it. The main focus is to help other soon-to-be young investors with tips and tricks along the journey. Learn from the mistakes that we have made and ignite the fire to set themselves up financially for the rest of their lives. If you're interested in sharing your story, you can go to jordanjong.com/podcasts, where there's a podcast inquiry button at the top that will guide you through the next steps. Also, if you want to see what else I'm up to, you can head over to my YouTube channel to see the latest. Just type Jordan de Jong into YouTube and I should pop up somewhere. If you're keen for more content like this, make sure you subscribe and please leave us a review with any feedback for future podcasts. And until next time, happy house hunting.